This is our farm's fertilizer buggy. It's getting to be a pretty old machine, but still works pretty good for us, and we cover a lot of acres with it. It's got wide flotation tires, so it can get across ground that's pretty wet and soft and doesn't sink in and damage the crop. The buggy's needing some work though. The steering on the front wheel is very worn out, and as you can see, there's a lot of play in it, and as you're going across the field, it really kind of has a mind of its own and is hard to control. Every time you hit a bump, the front fork slams up and down and usually rips the steering wheel out of my hands, which gets really frustrating. You can really see here when I'm not moving just how much play is in the steering. The hydraulic cylinder can move a long ways without moving the wheel. And the absolute worst is when you're on a paved road. We try to stay off the roads, but every now and then you have to use them to get to a field. And the front wheel just wobbles back and forth, and there's nothing you can do about it. We've worked on the steering a couple times now, trying to tighten it up, but we never had any luck. All the parts are just too worn out, and I never really liked the design to begin with. It just seems hobbled together and not heavy duty enough to withstand the heavy loads of fertilizer we put on it. So I decided to completely rebuild the front end. It's going to be a big project, but I have a couple ideas in mind for it, and I think it'll be a really big improvement for the machine and should hold up some years of heavy use on the farm. So I backed it into the shop and I got to work. Our neighbor down the road has a really nice fertilizer buggy that I've always admired. He uses it to do custom work with. Here he is fertilizing our wheat fields. And it's just a cool machine and a lot of fun to watch him drive it. It's a state-of-the-art spreader, having GPS auto steer, and is a dual product variable rate machine, much more advanced than ours, but that doesn't mean I can't take a little inspiration from it. And luckily, he didn't mind if I snapped a couple pictures and took some measurements. I don't think he's too worried about us giving him competition with our buggy. So I spent some time accurately modeling our buggy in SketchUp, and then once I had that, I was able to start working on a new design for the front end based off of our neighbors. I decided it was going to be easiest to just completely get rid of the front end that's there now, and then I'll have to cut the frame back a little ways, and then I could weld on these new pieces that come up at an angle, still allowing the engine to fit in the same spot. It doesn't start coming to a point until after the front part of the engine. And then I'll build a new fork to hold the same front tire and wheel. It took a while to incorporate this new design, but at this point I was feeling pretty confident in it, and I thought it still had a pretty good turn radius. You could test that out here. The thing I really liked about this design is that the two bearings that allow the wheel to turn are more spread out than the old spreader design. On the old spreader, they were only a couple inches apart, and then just a lot of leverage on those two bearings. So after I got approval from the head boss man, my dad, I jumped right in and got to work, to get as much done before he could second guess his decision. I pulled the old hood off and then disconnected the hydraulic cylinder and got it out of there. Started taking apart the old pivot point on the wheel, some rings up top here that are supposed to tighten down and keep the wheel tight, but we could never get them to tighten down for us. And then I grabbed the overhead hoist to lift up the buggy. And the wheel dropped right out. Another reason I thought it was really important to get this front wheel tightened up and running better is because it was really hard on that front tire. These tires are really expensive and it was wearing to one side, and I didn't think it would hold up much longer running it like it was. The guys over at the local Wilbur Ellis branch, where we buy our chemicals for the farm, were cool with me borrowing their tall jack stands, which were great for this. I definitely didn't want to leave the buggy on the hoist, and I wanted to make sure it was nice and sturdy because I was going to have to be getting underneath it. And my dad stopped by to either make sure I was working or to make sure I was being safe. Probably the latter.
Yeah, and I can get it in good shape, I think, for $1,000.
And to maybe understandably check up on the project budget. The first thing I decided to work on is the front fork here. I really wasn't looking forward to lifting this heavy piece of tubing into the bandsaw, but I was able to muscle it over. One thing I always do to set the height of the support rollers is to first balance the piece of tubing on just the bandsaw, center it, lock it down, and then I slide the roller over and raise it up to the height of the metal, and that way I know it's at the same height as the bandsaw. And then I can slide the tubing back to its first cut. I'm just squaring up the end here. I decided to cut the pieces down to length so they'd be easier to work with, leaving them just a couple inches longer than they need to be. All the pieces have very specific angles on them needed to get the shape I designed. That'll give me the turning radius and design I wanted. I have a lot of trouble using our small bandsaw to cut big tubing like this at angles and keeping them square. I actually have more luck drawing all the lines and then cutting them by hand with our plasma cutter. It takes a lot more time doing it this way, but I've been able to get the pieces to fit together a lot tighter than if I had used the bandsaw on cuts like these. The diagonal cuts, I hold the plasma cutter straight up and down to the metal, but on these straight cuts, I have to hold it at an angle so it cuts the metal in a single plane. Then I grab the grinder to clean up the cut. This piece actually needs 2 angles cut into it, and I've always found it a lot easier to be accurate when I cut and finish one side and then measure to the second side versus measure and cut both angles at once. The pieces fit together great, so I gathered all my clamps up and got them locked down to the table, and I started tacking them together. I decided I wanted to weld the inside seam of the outside 2 pieces before welding this middle piece. So to do that, I had to slide back the middle piece, welded it solid, and then now that these beads are there, the middle piece won't fit like it did anymore. So I had to take it out and bevel the edges slightly so it would fit back in like it originally did. After measuring and making sure it's back where it should be, I clamped it down and then welded that piece solid. After flipping it over, I could weld the underside. And then lastly, I came in and ground the top and bottom beads off because I wanted to make some brackets to reinforce these welds. Grabbed some cardstock paper and roughly sketched a shape I thought would work. And then I transferred this shape onto some 3/8 plate and cut it out with the plasma. And just like that, most of the front fork was done. Thanks for watching.